Hi everyone. This week we are reading two chapters from Ben Anderson's Imagined Communities. We're reading chapter 1 as well as chapter 3. We'll be looking at an argument that Ben Anderson makes that will for some of you be intuitive, yet for others it will be an uncomfortable idea. The concept we examine is the theory that your identity is imaginary. It is the idea that America is not real. It is the idea that all nations are fictions. It is the idea that borders only exist because we imagine them there. Now, this idea is a bit uncomfortable because many of you will have felt your identity as something fixed, real, and visceral. It's something that you often feel quite attached to. But when looked at in historical perspective, the very notion of the nation, or of the state, or of nationalism, is actually quite new. Before we go on to examine Ben Anderson's argument, I want each of you to take a moment to respond to this image. See here. So, in keeping with Stuart Hall's notion of the interrogation of the image, I want each of you to respond to how you're feeling from seeing this particular image. What are the first 2 or 3 words that surface to your consciousness? How does this image make you feel? Do you remember this event? For those of you who are Americans, does it generate feelings of anger, pride, national allegiance, or distrust? Does this image make you feel different about the United States or about the Muslim world? So, as you know, this image shows a single event that has the power to completely transform the national consciousness. 9/11, which some of you may be too young to remember, but all of you know as an event which ushered in the new era in U.S. and indeed in global politics, namely the age of the War on Terror. Images like this have the power to create publics within nations and beyond nations. There was a shared culture of sentiment, feeling, and affect around this particular catastrophic terrorist event. It brought Americans together, but it also made us very aware of who our enemies are. Okay, let's go back to where we stand now. The Western world is indeed experiencing an extreme return to nativist and nationalist ideology. Now, the term nativism means a policy of protecting the interest of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. Okay? So in Europe, this has been happening as a consequence of the massive influx seen in the past years from Northern Africa and the Middle East. There's been a sharp rise of ultra-right-wing nativist parties in countries like France, Denmark, and Sweden. And it seems like today, the United States is also increasingly returning to a nativist political stronghold, with presidential candidates running on platforms that seek to purge the nation of any foreign elements, especially Muslim or Mexican. This is pointing to a new kind of xenophobia in the United States, which is an intense or irrational dislike or fear even of people from other countries, people who are different from oneself, right? So these are some of the ways that The nation and nationalism are deeply entangled in our everyday lives and in politics. So, Benedict Anderson, in his Imagined Communities, famously shows that the nation is an imagined political community, and it is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. So here we see that communities don't just arise from nowhere, but that they are imagined through shared channels of communication. By being able to disseminate books, literature, and written information, a sense of imagined group coherence can suddenly be formed across vast swaths of landmass that before were autonomously governed. Anderson asserts that, I quote, "In the modern world, everyone can, should, and will have a nationality, as he or she has gender. Indeed, our identities are so profoundly bound up with our nationality that it is literally impossible to live without a nationality. Or at least if you do live without a nationality, you immediately become designated as a refugee, undocumented person, alien, or an illegal, as if a human being can be illegal by virtue of simply not having a nationality." That brings us to another part of. Okay. All right. This brings us to chapter 3 of Ben Anderson's Imagined Communities. This is really the crux of his argument, the most important aspect of the book. So here Anderson shows that it was the advent of print press media that allowed for the formation of nation states. So previously, the world's people were ruled through imperialism, feudalism, tribalism, or colonialism. So the nation state is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, and it arose thanks to the invention of one ingenious medium, the print press. So we've really only had the rise of nations for the last 200 or 300 years. So in terms of the vast span of human history, the nation is not necessarily a very natural extension of how humans have organized historically. But we all seem to take it for granted as the way that the world ought to be organized, right? So in chapter 3, Anderson discusses the origins of national consciousness as an intersection between capitalism and print. So you have this system of production, right, which is capitalism, producing goods and services in exchange for money. And then you also have this rise of print press technology, which allows people to communicate with each other without actually speaking with each other, right? And another aspect that's important here is what Anderson calls the fatality of human linguistic diversity. And this is wherein you used to have a myriad of spoken vernacular languages that since the advent of capitalism and print press media have now been narrowed down to a much smaller concentration of languages. So you can imagine, for instance, in the United States, you had various Native American tribes who all spoke different languages. As the British, later Americans, invaded the United States, those languages were mostly completely wiped out, and English then became the main language. And you see this happening with England taking over various colonies, France taking over various colonies, and then also sort of wiping out the dialects and all of the different diverse languages and making one standard language. Okay, so print capitalism gave this new fixity to language that was previously unattainable in the era of copied manuscripts. So before, people used to have to copy manuscripts by hand, and now you can just print press all these books, and that allows for a standardization of the language that before was virtually impossible. And as we know from the realm of linguistics, he who controls language, he who controls word and discourse, also has a great amount of power. So the former types of states where the majority of the population speaks the official print language, Anderson traces to the first Republican nation states as the Anglo and Spanish Americas, right? And these are the states where the majority of the population doesn't speak or write in the official state language, such as the ex-colonial states in Africa. So these states were very much incorporated and made more homogeneous due to these super-level state mandated languages. Okay, so that's sort of the very simplistic argument of Ben Anderson. So what does this mean for our current century? Well, the major challenge of our century in regards to the maintenance of nation states and the question of whether or not the nation state paradigm is one that we ought to prescribe to as a human race. The major problem is without a doubt the migration crisis. So how do we create systems of governance that account for the millions of people who are actively excluded by the current nation-state system, or who are undergoing oppression from the state, such as the people of Syria are undergoing right now, or such as the people of Burma have been undergoing over the past 50 years? 2015 saw the highest increase in global migrations due to war in recorded history, and there is little evidence that global mass migrations are slowing. At the same time, migration routes are becoming deadlier as migrants fleeing war and violence are imperiling their lives in order to reach other shores. Reports show that 3,700 refugees have died making this dangerous trip across the Mediterranean Sea in 2015 alone. Okay, and it looks like, by all measures, 2016 will see many more people making this perilous journey across the ocean. We also know that as temperatures continue to rise, droughts become prolonged, and dangerous weather patterns become more dramatic. And as this happens, the refugees of our century will increasingly become climate refugees. There already are millions of climate refugees, but there are only going to be more as the world's climate continues to change. So we must ask ourselves, will it be viable in the coming century for the human race to organize itself into these tightly knit nations that often serve to exclude rather than include others who are desperately in need of being included into territories where they actually have a chance of surviving? Some discussion questions to get you thinking about this reading. How does the written word form imagined national identities? Okay, so think about the kind of media that you are exposed to, and how does that either serve to entrench or subvert your national identity? And a more personal question. In what way does the thesis of imagined communities change your relationship to your own country or nation, right? This is the kind of thesis that can really make you think quite differently about maybe your own nationalist ideas, right? And related to that, how is nationalism dangerous? Is it dangerous? Something for you to think about. Can we solve the current migration crisis while still maintaining national borders? Okay, that's the brief lecture for this week. Happy reading, writing, and thinking.